The thing about memory is that it sticks to senses, not just to facts. If I close my eyes, I can still feel the sting of cold Colorado air on my cheeks, and I can smell that particular mix of dust and rain that clung to the night I lost everything. I was 17, standing at the edge of my childhood on the cracked driveway of the house I had called home for as long as I could remember. It was one of those old, two-story houses that everyone assumes comes with happy memories, a place with faded blue siding and a porch that creaked in the wind. But on that night, it felt less like a home and more like a stage set for a tragedy I never wanted to star in. My whole life fit inside a trash bag. That's not an exaggeration. I held it tightly, so tightly that the plastic dug into my palm and left red marks. Inside were a few clothes, some battered notebooks, a photo or two from a time when we still smiled together, and the crumpled bills and coins that made up my $57. If you had seen me then, you probably wouldn't have noticed anything special. Just a teenage girl in an oversized flannel shirt, jeans that had seen better days, sneakers coming apart at the toes. But I was acutely aware of how small and exposed I felt, as if the entire city of Boulder could see the truth about me. My mother, Elizabeth, stood in the doorway. She had always been graceful, elegant in that old-fashioned way that some women are, but on that night she looked like someone forced into a role she did not want. Her arms were folded tight across her chest, lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't look at me, not once. Her gaze stayed fixed somewhere over my shoulder, like she was trying to look past me, trying to see the life she'd have if I simply disappeared. My father, Charles, was more straightforward. He stood behind her, jaw clenched, eyes cold with a kind of disappointment that had started years before. "It's for the best," he said, as if those words could soften the blow. The way he said it, slow and rehearsed, made me wonder how long they'd been planning this. Did they talk about me after I went to bed, deciding my fate like judges at a trial I never got to attend? I wanted to shout that I hadn't done what they said I did, that I was innocent. But by then, my words no longer mattered in that house. And there was Lucas, my brother Lucas, who had always been the favorite. If you grew up with a sibling who could do no wrong, you'll understand how it feels to be compared, measured, and found lacking in every way that matters. Lucas was a year older, popular at school, good at sports, charming enough that even adults believed he could never lie. He stood on the porch, hands buried in his pockets, watching me with an expression I still can't quite read. Maybe there was guilt there, or maybe just relief that it wasn't him standing on the cold concrete, with nowhere to go. We had fought just a few hours earlier, voices raised, accusations thrown, but the root of the trouble was older than either of us. That night, my parents accused me of something I didn't do. They said I had stolen money from Charles's desk, money he swore he'd left in the envelope for bills. But I hadn't taken a cent. The truth was, Lucas had needed cash to impress his friends at a concert in Denver. He confessed to me in whispers, promising he'd make it right, but he never did. When the envelope turned up empty, all eyes turned to me. After all, I was the one with the lower grades, the one who didn't fit neatly into their plans for a picture-perfect family. When Lucas said nothing, I realized that silence can be as sharp as betrayal. No one offered me a ride, not even to the corner. I waited for someone, anyone, to change their mind, to tell me this was a terrible mistake and to come back inside. The lights in the house switched off one by one, first in the living room, then upstairs, then the porch itself, until I stood alone in darkness with only the dim street lamp for company. I heard the soft click of the lock sliding into place. In that moment, it was as if I'd never existed to them at all. The street was quiet. It was late enough that most families were asleep, safe and warm inside their houses. The wind picked up, tugging at my hair and making the shadows dance along the sidewalk. I looked at the house one last time, hoping for a curtain to twitch or a door to open. Nothing happened. I started walking because there was nothing else to do. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay there any longer. My feet carried me away from the only world I knew. I walked past the old oak tree that used to shade us during summer barbecues, past the park where Lucas and I once chased fireflies, past neighbors' houses where porch lights glowed softly behind curtains. My thoughts spun in circles. half-formed, plans clashing with fear. Where would I sleep? What would I eat? Could I find anyone who would believe me, who would help me? Every answer felt impossibly far away. Eventually, I made my way to a convenience store just off Pearl Street. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I sat on the curb, knees drawn up to my chest, counting my money for the 100th time. I knew it wasn't enough. Not for rent, not for a bus ticket out of town, maybe not even for a decent meal. I bought a bottle of water and a granola bar, watching the cashier's eyes flicker with suspicion as I paid in quarters and dimes. I wanted to tell her that I wasn't a thief, that I was just unlucky. But pride kept my mouth shut. I wandered the city through the small hours, ducking into alleys when patrol cars passed, my breath clouding in the cold. Every sound seemed magnified. The distant bark of a dog, the rumble of a train, the rush of wind through empty streets. At one point, I caught my reflection in a shop window. My hair was tangled, my eyes wide with exhaustion and fear. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize myself. The girl in the glass looked older than 17, worn thin by more than just hunger or cold. By sunrise, I found myself behind a grocery store, too tired to keep walking. I curled up beneath an empty cardboard box, hugging my trash bag close. The asphalt was hard and unforgiving, but at least it was dry. I tried to sleep, but every noise made me flinch. I wondered what my parents were doing, whether Lucas was thinking about me at all, whether the world would keep spinning without me. I thought about all the times I'd begged them to see me for who I was, not who they believed I'd become. But regret is a useless companion when you're alone in the dark. That first day was a blur of exhaustion and hunger. I watched shoppers come and go, families chatting about dinner plans, couples holding hands, children whining for candy at the checkout. I felt invisible and exposed all at once, desperate for help and terrified of being noticed. When a manager came outside to smoke, I kept my head down, afraid he'd call the police or worse, tell me to leave. Instead, he dropped his cigarette, ground it under his shoe, and went back inside without a word. I exhaled shakily, grateful for his indifference. As the hours dragged on, I began to make plans. I remembered there was a shelter across town. Janet, my old English teacher, had once mentioned volunteering there. If I could make it before dark, maybe I'd find a bed. Maybe I'd find someone who cared enough to ask my side of the story. I promised myself I wouldn't cry, not where anyone could see me. I would survive this, if only to prove them all wrong. I spent the rest of the day wandering Boulder's side streets, avoiding the main roads where I might run into someone from school. I didn't want to explain, didn't want to see the pity or suspicion in their eyes. My hunger grew sharper, gnawing at my insides until it was all I could think about. When I found a dollar bill in a parking lot, it felt like a miracle. I bought a stale pastry from a gas station and savored every bite, telling myself that things would get better. Evening fell, and I made my way to the shelter Janet had told me about. The building was plain and sturdy, with a faded mural of mountains on the side. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of disinfectant. The woman at the front desk looked tired, but kind. She didn't ask questions, just handed me a blanket and pointed to a cot near the back. For the first time in 24 hours, I felt something like relief. I was safe, at least for the night. Lying on that narrow cot, I thought about the last words my father had spoken. It's for the best. I wondered if he believed it, if he slept easier without me under his roof. I wondered if my mother regretted letting me go, or if she had already rewritten the story in her mind. I wondered if Lucas would ever tell the truth, or if he'd let the lie stand forever. Most of all, I wondered who I was without them. As sleep claimed me, I realized I wasn't running away from my family. Not really. I was running towards something I couldn't name yet, something that would take years to find. I knew only this. I would survive, not just to spite them, but to discover the person I could become when I was no longer defined by their disappointment. That night was the beginning of my story, the first chapter of a life I never expected to lead. And even now, all these years later, I carry the lessons of that night with me. The strength it takes to let go, the courage it takes to begin again, and the unshakable belief that every ending is just the start of something new. If there's a particular sound I'll always associate with my first years in Chicago, it's the whistle and screech of the L train overhead. It became a sort of soundtrack to my new life, the rhythmic rumble in the bones of the city, echoing the restlessness in my chest. When I stepped off the Greyhound on a chilly gray morning, the city greeted me with indifference. The wind cut through my thin jacket, and people bustled past with their eyes on the pavement, hands dug deep in their pockets. Nobody noticed a skinny girl with a trash bag slung over her shoulder, trying to decide which way to walk. And that anonymity was both terrifying and freeing. Chicago was enormous compared to Boulder. The buildings seemed to stretch forever, glass and steel slicing into the sky, and the sidewalks hummed with the lives of millions. I quickly learned that if you move with purpose, if you walk fast enough and look determined, most people won't bother you. That was a relief, because for a long time I was afraid that someone might look too closely and see through me, see the fear and loneliness I tried to hide behind a mask of exhaustion. Those first weeks were harder than anything I'd ever imagined. I barely had enough money for the cheapest room at a hostel near the river. The air in the room was stale, heavy with the smell of mildew and old sweat, and the thin mattress felt like sleeping on a stack of newspapers. There were others like me, young people clinging to hope, older folks who'd run out of options, and in-betweeners with nowhere else to go. Some kept to themselves, while others traded stories late at night, their laughter brittle, their eyes shadowed by the kind of worry you can't shake. I didn't trust anyone, not yet. I kept my things close, using my trash bag as a pillow, and slept in my clothes with one eye open. My priority was survival. I spent hours scanning bulletin boards and tattered flyers taped to lampposts. Help wanted. No experience necessary. Evening shifts, paid in cash. Looking for a dishwasher, call after 4 p.m. I wandered into diners and bodegas, asking if they needed extra help. Most of the time, the answer was a shrug or a shake of the head. But persistence eventually pays off, even if only in small ways. I found my first job at a rundown 24-hour diner called Charlie's Grill on the edge of Uptown, working the graveyard shift as a waitress. The owner, Mrs. Foster, was a no-nonsense woman with dyed red hair and a voice like gravel. She hired me because she liked the way I looked her in the eye when I said I was willing to work any hours, no questions asked. My uniform was a faded blue dress with a collar that never quite lay flat and an apron with more stains than I could count. I poured coffee for truckers, refilled ketchup bottles, wiped down sticky booths, and cleared plates long after midnight. The tips were unpredictable. Sometimes a couple of crumpled ones, sometimes nothing at all. The pay was $8 and hour in cash slipped into an envelope at the end of each week. I tried not to think about how little it was. At least it was enough for bread, eggs, and the occasional bus fare. Every day felt like a test I hadn't studied for. I took extra shifts at the diner when I could, and when I wasn't there, I hustled for more work. I cleaned offices in the EI. Loop at midnight, the smell of bleach and floor wax burning my nostrils as I scrubbed floors and emptied trash cans. Some nights, when I was too tired to walk back to the hostel and couldn't afford a train ride, I'd find a bench in the waiting area of Union Station, trying to sleep upright, clutching my bag in my lap. I'd watch the early morning commuters stream in, clean, well-dressed, well-fed, and wondered what it would be like to be one of them. It's strange how quickly you learn to stretch a dollar. I became an expert in small economies. How to make a pound of rice last a week, how to find discount bread at closing time, how to keep warm in the winter by walking the aisles of a 24-hour pharmacy until my fingers stopped tingling. On nights when I was desperate, I'd count out my change and treat myself to a cup of watery diner coffee just so I could sit in the warmth, listening to the city's pulse outside. I learned the trick of layering 2 pairs of socks and how to keep my spirits up by thinking a day or two ahead instead of months. Big dreams would have been a luxury. Survival was all I could afford. Little by little, my world started to grow, mostly by necessity. One afternoon at Charlie's, I met Lila, a soft-spoken woman who ran the bakery downstairs from the diner. She wore flour like a badge of honor, her hair always pulled back in a messy bun, and her laughter filled the kitchen even on the hardest days. Lila started saving me day-old bread and pastries that she would have thrown out, packing them in brown paper bags with a quiet smile. She never asked about my story, never pried, and I was grateful for that. Kindness is often wordless. I also met Mr. Peterson, who owned the corner store a few blocks from where I sometimes slept. He was a wiry man in his 70s, with sharp, blue eyes and a habit of humming old jazz tunes as he restocked shelves. He let me buy soup cans at cost and always snuck in an extra granola bar if he thought I looked tired. He told me once, "You remind me of my granddaughter, stubborn, independent, probably too smart for her good." It was the closest thing to family warmth I'd felt in years. There were bad days, plenty of them. I remember losing my job at the cleaning company because the manager caught me dozing off in the supply closet during a break. There were nights when my shoes were soaked through and I thought I'd never get warm again. Days when I skipped meals to make sure I had enough for rent or to keep my cell phone active, just in case someone called about a job. But there were also moments of hope. Like the day I saw a flyer for free adult education classes at a community center in Edgewater. I signed up immediately, telling myself that learning something, anything, might be the ticket out of this endless grind. The community center became my haven. There, I met Janet, a retired English teacher who volunteered as a tutor for students of all ages and backgrounds. Janet was in her late 60s, with a quick wit and a heart bigger than the city itself. She noticed how hungry I was for knowledge, and she took me under her wing, helping me with everything from essay writing to budgeting. It was Janet who first looked me in the eye and said, "Some people are born into homes. Others build them." That phrase lodged in my heart and never left. Janet became the anchor in my otherwise stormy life. She'd invite me over for tea on Saturday afternoons, and her apartment smelled like lemon polish and vanilla. The walls were lined with books, classics, poetry, memoirs, and we'd sit together for hours talking about everything and nothing. She never pitied me, never treated me as fragile, but she always listened when I needed to talk. She believed in me, sometimes more than I believed in myself, and she encouraged me to keep going even on the days when it all felt pointless. It took me 3 months to save up enough for a real place of my own, a tiny studio apartment on the 3rd floor of a brick building in Uptown. The ceilings were water-stained, the radiator clanged and sputtered all night, and the window looked out onto a battered fire escape. But when I signed the lease and held the keys in my hand, I felt an electric rush of pride. For the first time, I had a door to lock behind me, a place that was mine, however humble. I set up my life in miniature: a thrift store mattress, a battered hot plate, a single mug and spoon. I taped postcards of places I wanted to visit on the wall: New York, Paris, London, even Lake Michigan, just a few miles away but impossibly far in those first months. I built my days around routines: working, studying, sleeping, hustling for the next paycheck. I stopped counting the days since I'd left Boulder. My past faded into the background, except for the nights when old memories surfaced. My father's hard eyes, my mother's averted gaze, the sound of Lucas's laughter, echoing down the hallway. In those moments, I reminded myself that survival was already a victory. I was making something out of nothing, bit by bit, dollar by dollar. It was around this time that I began to hear whispers about Lucas. Even 2,000 miles away, his name had a way of finding me. Boulder was abuzz with news of his tech startup, AI flashy app with European investors, articles in local business magazines, and interviews on the radio. I saw photos online: Lucas in a tailored suit, shaking hands with CEOs, his smile confident and effortless. I wondered if he ever thought about me, if he regretted keeping silent the night I was cast out. But those thoughts were dangerous, so I kept them at bay. I watched his life unfold from a distance, always feeling the sharp contrast between our worlds. While Lucas thrived, I struggled, but I never stopped moving forward. I used Janet's guidance to enroll in night classes at a city college, juggling shifts at the diner and the bakery to pay for tuition and textbooks. I became an expert in resilience, learning how to face rejection with grace and disappointment with grit. The people around me, my patchwork family, became my lifeline. Lila, with her endless supply of stories and bread. Mr. Peterson, with his jazz and wisdom. Janet, with her steady encouragement and faith. One winter evening, after a particularly long shift, I found myself walking home under the sodium glow of streetlights, snow swirling in the air. I thought about how far I'd come, about the thousands of small decisions that had led me here, to this city, to this moment. I realized with a kind of quiet astonishment that I was no longer running from my past. I was building something new, something mine. That realization didn't erase the pain, or the loneliness, or the hunger. But it gave me purpose. I wasn't just surviving. I was beginning to live. Chicago became more than just a city. It became my proving ground, the place where I learned to turn hardship into hope. Looking back now, I see that those years were more than just a test. They were the foundation of everything I would become: resilient, resourceful, fiercely independent. I learned that family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the people who choose to stand beside you when you have nothing to offer but your determination. In a city of millions, I found the strength to stand alone, and in doing so, I discovered the beginnings of the woman I would one day be. If you had told my 17-year-old self that, a little over a decade later, I would have my name on the VR window of a creative agency in the heart of Chicago, I would have laughed in your face. Or maybe I would have cried. In those early years, the idea of success felt like something that happened to other people. People like Lucas, who never seemed to struggle, or the polished executives who breezed through the city in expensive coats, their eyes focused straight ahead. I was just trying to keep my head above water, one day at a time. But hard work, I discovered, has a way of remaking you, cell by cell, thought by thought. I started small. Janet, with her boundless encouragement, helped me apply to night school. I spent my days working shifts at Charlie's Grill and the bakery, then sat through classes on marketing, business writing, and design until late at night. There were times when I nearly quit, exhausted to the bone, but Janet's belief in me was unshakable. "The world needs more people like you," she would say, sliding a cup of tea across her kitchen table. "People who know what it means to begin again." It was at a networking event for young professionals, something I almost skipped out of anxiety, that I landed my first real job. I remember standing in a borrowed blazer, nervously fiddling with the cheap pen clipped to my pocket, rehearsing, my pitch in my head. When I met Lauren Maxwell, the founder of a boutique marketing firm, I didn't try to hide my background. I told her about starting with nothing, about cleaning offices at midnight and learning to write ad copy on the backs of receipts. Maybe she saw something of her beginnings in me, because she took a chance, hiring me as a junior account coordinator. The job was a revelation. For the first time, I worked in an office where my ideas were heard, where no one cared about my past, only my work. I was the first to arrive and the last to leave, determined to make every project better than the last. I read every book I could borrow, soaked up feedback like a sponge, and built relationships with clients who appreciated my candor and creativity. Slowly, my confidence grew. I saw that the traits that once made me an outsider, my independence, my resilience, my relentless drive, were my greatest assets. By the time I was 25, I had been promoted twice. My portfolio was bursting with successful campaigns, and I'd made a name for myself as the person who could turn even the smallest idea into something memorable. Clients started requesting me by name, and I found myself managing teams, overseeing accounts for brands I'd only ever seen on billboards. The money was still tight at first, but I learned how to budget, save, and invest. I traded my threadbare jackets for sharp blazers, and my single thrift store mug for a set of hand-thrown pottery. Every time I signed a new lease, moving from one apartment to a slightly better one, I felt the old fear receding. The trapdoor under my feet had finally turned into a floor I could trust. Yet, the real turning point came when Lauren announced she was moving to New York to head up a major agency and offered to sell me her shares in the Chicago firm. I didn't have much in the way of savings, but with a bank loan and every dollar I'd stashed away, I leaped. The moment I signed the paperwork, I became the owner of Maxwell & Cover Creative, with a staff of 8 and a handful of loyal clients. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving. I was building something of my own. Those first months were a blur of 12-hour days and sleepless nights. I worried constantly about payroll, about client retention, about whether I was fooling myself. But I threw myself into the work, drawing on every lesson learned from scraping by in Chicago, every ounce of resourcefulness honed during those lean years. Slowly, the agency grew. We landed a contract with a national apparel brand, then a beverage company with roots in Europe. The agency's reputation spread through word of mouth and a few lucky magazine features. Suddenly, my name was appearing in local business write-ups, alongside glowing profiles and glossy photos. I smiled for the camera, thinking of the girl I once was, clutching a trash bag in Boulder, utterly alone. I bought a townhouse in Lincoln Park, a place with sunlight streaming in through tall windows, hardwood floors that glowed golden in the IR evenings, and a kitchen big enough to host friends for dinner. I filled the rooms with secondhand furniture and the laughter of people who had become my chosen family. Janet, who cheered every milestone, Lila, who baked me bread for every occasion, and a rotating cast of colleagues and neighbors who accepted me for exactly who I was. My bank account, once a constant source of anxiety, now felt like a life raft, solid, buoyant, safe. I thought for a while that the past was behind me, that the old wounds had finally closed. I focused on my clients, on growing the business, on savoring the life I had built from scratch. But the past, I learned, has a way of finding you when you least expect it. It was a Tuesday morning when I received the first email. The subject line was innocuous. "Hello, from Mom." But the sight of it stopped me cold. It had been years since I'd heard from my mother. I stared at her name for a long time before opening the message. Her words were careful, almost formal. She wrote about the weather in Boulder, about how much the city had changed. She didn't mention the night I'd left, didn't mention Lucas or my father, only that she hoped I was well and perhaps we could catch up sometime soon. I closed the email without replying, my hands trembling. It felt as though the floor had dropped out from under me again. A few days later, another message arrived, this time from my father. His words were even more clipped, as if he were writing to a distant acquaintance. He said he'd heard I was doing well in Chicago and hoped I might be able to call when I had a moment. It was only then that I learned the truth. Their finances had collapsed. Bad investments, a real estate downturn, and most painfully, the collapse of Lucas's company. The old house in Boulder, the house I'd once called home, was gone, lost to foreclosure. Lucas, for all his early promise, had seen his startup flame out in spectacular fashion, leaving creditors and angry investors in its wake. The favored son, it seemed, had finally run out of luck. I wish I could say that I felt only relief or vindication, but the reality was messier. Part of me ached for the life we could have had, for the family that might have been if only things had gone differently. But another part of me, older, wiser, forged in the fire of survival, felt something like clarity. For years, I had carried the weight of their rejection, blaming myself for the choices they had made. Now, as I read their pleas for help, I saw their actions for what they were: fear, pride, and a refusal to see me for who I was. They needed a place to stay, my mother wrote in a second message, just until they could get back on their feet. My father asked if I might help with a small loan, maybe a few $1,000s, just until the next opportunity came along. Lucas, once silent, reached out too, his tone breezy and casual, as if nothing had ever happened between us. He mentioned he was thinking of moving to Chicago for a fresh start and hoped I could show him around. Each message reopened old wounds, but they also sparked something new inside me. For so long, I had dreamed of proving myself to the family that cast me aside. I had fantasized about the day they would see my success and finally acknowledge the truth. Now, here it was, and I felt only a hollow sense of victory. Their requests were not apologies. There was no acknowledgement of the pain, no acceptance of responsibility, only need and expectation. For the first time in my life, I stood my ground. I wrote back, simply and honestly, telling them I was not able to help, that I could not offer a place to stay. I told them I needed time and space, that the wounds between us were not healed by circumstance. It was one of the hardest things I have ever done. Harder in some ways than surviving those early years alone. But as soon as I pressed send, I felt a weight lift from my chest. I was no longer the desperate girl begging to be loved. I was a woman who had built her own life on her terms. Word spread quickly among the extended family. Cousins, aunts, and uncles I hadn't spoken to in years began to reach out, asking questions, offering unsolicited advice, sometimes even criticism. "How can you turn your back on your parents?" one aunt wrote. "After everything they've done for you?" The old narrative, the one that painted me as the difficult child, the troublemaker, threatened to surface again. But this time, I was ready. When the family gathered for a wedding in Milwaukee, I decided to attend. I felt a flutter of nerves as I walked into the crowded banquet hall, but I held my head high. When the inevitable questions came, I told the truth. I told them about the night I was cast out, about the years of silence and blame, about the lies that had protected Lucas at my expense. I told them how I had survived, alone, and built a life from nothing. It was as if a dam had broken. Faces shifted, some with shock, others with sorrow or guilt. Stories began to surface about old resentments, secret rivalries, the ways our family had always protected its favorites. The lies that had sheltered Lucas began to unravel, and for the first time, the truth had room to breathe. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse or demand apologies. I simply told my story, clearly and calmly, and let the facts speak for themselves. The aftermath was complicated, as reckonings always are. Some relatives distanced themselves, unwilling to confront the truths I had revealed. Others reached out quietly, offering support or apologies for the ways they had misunderstood. My parents, faced with the consequences of years of denial, retreated into silence. Lucas, stripped of his golden status, was forced to reckon with his actions for the first time. Through it all, I felt something shifting inside me. I was no longer defined by what I had lost or by the family that had abandoned me. I was defined by what I had built, by the resilience and courage that had carried me through. For the first time, I felt truly free, not just from my past, but from the need for anyone's approval. In the end, success was not about the money or the townhouse or the magazine covers. It was about reclaiming my story, speaking my truth, and standing tall in the life I had created for myself. I had survived not just despite what happened to me, but because of it. And as I walked home through the streets of Chicago, the city glowing beneath the evening sky, I knew that I had finally come home to myself. After everything that had happened, the long years of silence and struggle, the public unraveling of old family myths, the unexpected return of those who had once cast me aside, the world felt quieter, not empty, but still. The chaos had burned itself out, leaving behind something almost gentle, like the hush after a storm when sunlight glints on the water, and the only sound is your steady breathing. When the dust settled, it was Janet who remained at my side. In a city where everyone was always coming or going, Janet was a constant. She had been there for the smallest moments and the largest ones, listening when I felt voiceless, encouraging when I faltered, celebrating when I triumphed. She saw the parts of me that had been too fragile to share with anyone else, the old wounds that never quite disappeared, the dreams I was afraid to speak aloud. Through everything, her presence was never about grand gestures. It was the everyday kindnesses, the cup of tea she set beside me during late-night study sessions, the emails she sent after tough days at the office, the gentle squeeze of her hand when words felt too heavy. Janet's apartment always smelled of vanilla and fresh bread, her bookshelves lined with stories from every continent. She loved poetry and yellow tulips, kept a faded photograph of her late husband on the mantel, and insisted that no visitor leave her home hungry. Over time, I came to think of her place as my second home, a sanctuary where nothing was ever demanded and everything was freely given. But even constants must one day change. When Janet became ill, it happened quietly. Just a cough at first, a bit of tiredness, a string of canceled outings. She brushed off my concern, promising it was nothing, but I could see her slowing down, see the way her hands trembled over her teacup and the way she would pause mid-sentence, as if gathering strength. I tried to return her kindness, visiting, as often as I could, bringing groceries and reading aloud from her favorite novels. Sometimes she'd doze as I read, the afternoon light pooling across her blanket. In those gentle hours, the world outside faded, and I found peace in just being with her. When Janet passed, it felt as though a thread connecting me to this world had gone slack. I grieved for her quietly, in ways that surprised me. The sight of tulips in the grocery store, the sound of jazz on the radio, the hush of her apartment when I picked up the last of her things. I had always thought of grief as sharp and sudden, but Janet's loss was more like a tide, coming and going, gentle and persistent, never quite receding. I didn't know at first that she'd left me her house. The news came in a letter, delivered on a rainy Thursday by a solemn attorney who spoke in soft, respectful tones. The letter itself was simple, written in Janet's looping hand. "Family is who stays when you have nothing to give," she'd written. "You were my family, and I hope this house gives you the peace and belonging you always deserved." I held the letter to my chest and wept, not only for Janet, but for every part of my life that had led me to her, for every closed door that made this new one so meaningful. The house was on a quiet street in Evanston, just north of Chicago, a modest two-story with a sloping yard and a garden that Janet had lovingly tended for years. The first time I stepped through the door as its owner, I felt a sense of belonging that I had never felt in Boulder, or even in my sun-filled Lincoln Park townhouse. This house was not a symbol of status or achievement. It was a gift, freely given, a safe harbor after years spent adrift. Moving in was both a homecoming and a new beginning. I spent the first days in a daze, wandering from room to room, reacquainting myself with the creak of the floorboards and the soft afternoon light slanting through the kitchen windows. Janet's presence lingered everywhere. In the dog-eared recipe cards stacked by the stove, the yellow tulips painted on the tiles in the bathroom, the shelf of books by her favorite chair. I left many things just as she had, finding comfort in the continuity. With the house came responsibilities, and I threw myself into them, tending the garden Janet had loved so much. The earth was rich and dark, and I spent hours pulling weeds, turning soil, and planting new shoots alongside the old. One afternoon, I planted a young maple tree in the backyard, pressing my palms into the dirt and making a silent promise. I would not let the pain of my past decide my future. I would root myself here in hope and gratitude and let new things grow. The neighborhood welcomed me with cautious curiosity. Evanston had a slower pace than the city. Neighbors waved from porches, children biked along the sidewalk, and there was always someone tending a garden or sweeping a stoop. At first, I felt a strange mix of visibility and invisibility. I was the newcomer in Janet's house, and for a while, that was how people addressed me. "You're Janet's girl, aren't you?" Mrs. Dalrymple asked as I checked the mail. "She talked about you all the time." I smiled, surprised and grateful for the warmth in her voice. Slowly, I began to feel less like an outsider and more like a neighbor. My friends from Chicago visited often, filling the house with laughter and stories. Lila came with loaves of fresh bread and an endless supply of bakery gossip. My colleagues dropped by for backyard barbecues, crowding around the table Janet once used for her book club. There were quiet evenings, too, when I sat on the porch with a glass of wine, listening to the distant hum of trains and thinking about all that had changed. Sometimes it seemed impossible that the lonely girl with a trash bag and $57 had become this woman, strong, independent, surrounded by love. And yet, the past had left its mark. Even as I found joy in new beginnings, there were moments when old memories surfaced, shadows that lingered at the edges of the light. Sometimes I woke in the night, heart pounding, half dreaming of Boulder and the night I was cast out. Other times, I would catch myself expecting loss, flinching at the idea that this peace might be taken away. But each time, I reminded myself of Janet's words and of my promise. The story I told myself now was one of survival, not abandonment, of possibility, not fear. The aftermath of the family reckoning continued to ripple. Some relatives reached out tentatively, testing the waters, offering apologies or explanations. Others maintained their distance, unwilling to revisit old wounds or acknowledge the truth. I had finally spoken. My parents, for the most part, remained silent, their pride and guilt holding them at arm's length. Lucas, too, drifted in and out of contact, trying at times to rekindle a sibling bond, but never fully addressing the past. I learned to let go, not out of anger, but out of self-preservation. I wished them well, but I no longer waited for apologies or validation. My peace did not depend on their approval. Instead, I found family in the people who chose me. My circle became small but strong, a patchwork of friends, neighbors, and colleagues who had stood by me in good times and bad. We celebrated birthdays and holidays together, grieved losses, and marked milestones with homemade cake and laughter that filled every corner of the house. Over time, Janet's home became not just my sanctuary, but a gathering place for others, seeking comfort and belonging. I kept Janet's letter on my nightstand, reading it on hard days and happy ones alike. Its message became my mantra. Family is who stays when you have nothing to give. I often thought about what it meant to belong, and how much of my life had been spent chasing the approval of people who could never truly see me. Here, in this home, I realized that belonging was not something you earned, but something you received and then gave in turn. It was in the sharing of meals, the tending of gardens, and the laughter echoing through the rooms. With time, I began to give back, just as Janet had done for me. I volunteered at the community center, tutoring young people who were starting over just as I once had. I opened my door to friends who needed a place to stay, offering them not just a couch or a meal, but a sense of welcome, of safety. I supported local causes and joined neighborhood committees, finding meaning in being part of something larger than myself. Each act of kindness felt like a stone laid in the foundation of this new life, rooting me more deeply in the present. Some evenings, I would sit beneath the growing maple tree in the backyard, feeling the rough bark under my palm, watching the leaves tremble in the breeze. The tree was young, its trunk still slender, but I imagined the years to come, the shade it would give, the birds that would nest in its branches, the children who might one day play beneath it. It was a living testament to the idea that growth comes slowly, quietly, with patience and care. It was a promise to myself that I would continue to choose hope, to plant new roots even when the past tried to pull me back. Looking back, I sometimes wished I could speak to my 17-year-old self, the girl with the trash bag, walking into the night with nothing but a few dollars and a heart full of fear. I would tell her that survival is not the same as living, and that one day she would do more than just endure. I would tell her that the pain she carried would become the soil from which new things could grow, that she would build a home not of brick and wood, but of dignity and hope, surrounded by the people who truly loved her. And in the end, I realized that the story I had once thought was about loss and abandonment was really about transformation. I was no longer defined by who let me in or who turned me away. I was defined by the ones who stayed, who chose me, and by the choice I made every day to keep moving forward, planting new beginnings and standing firmly rooted in self-worth. That, at last, was home.
My name is Caroline Evans, and I was raised in a house where every inch seemed to echo with history and ambition. Growing up in Boston, Massachusetts, especially in our old red brick house perched on the edge of Beacon Hill, I learned early that my last name carried weight. The Evans family was renowned for its long line of lawyers, all of whom were fierce, polished, and relentless in their pursuit of success. Sometimes it felt like our home itself was watching over me, making sure I followed every expectation laid out for me by generations past. The oil portraits lining the staircase seemed to frown in disapproval whenever I lingered too long with my thoughts. My father, Richard Evans, was the kind of man people whispered about in the marble corridors of the courthouse. He ran Evans and Associates with an unshakable grip, a presence that filled every room he entered. He had a way of making decisions sound like laws that had already been passed. Even his laughter, deep and booming, felt like it had been rehearsed for a courtroom. My mother, Margaret, was softer in her speech but no less demanding in her expectations. She orchestrated charity galas from our parlor, making our home a revolving door for judges' wives, senators, and other families steeped in Boston society's traditions. When she wasn't planning events, she was attending them, always dressed in her pearls and cashmere, her approval doled out in small, precious doses. From the moment I was old enough to hold a pen, the path ahead of me was laid out: top grades, the right friends, and eventually Harvard Law, just as my father had done and his father before him. I was the only daughter, and with that came a unique blend of pride and pressure. I excelled in school, partly because it was expected and partly because I was terrified of letting anyone down. At home, dinner conversations revolved around landmark cases and legislative debates. Even as a child, I learned to listen, to ask the right questions, to give answers that made my father's eyes light up with approval. Sometimes I wondered if I was loved or simply admired. By the time I was finishing my undergraduate degree, there was never any question about my next step. I was accepted into Harvard Law, and my family celebrated with the kind of dinner usually reserved for judicial appointments. I remember my father's hand on my shoulder, heavy and warm, as he announced to the table that the Evans name would carry on. My mother just smiled, but I could see the relief in her eyes, as if a burden had finally been lifted. Law school was everything I had been prepared for: grueling, competitive, and relentless. I threw myself into my studies, but as the months passed, a kind of numbness began to settle over me. I sat in those grand lecture halls, surrounded by classmates who were as driven as I was, yet something inside me felt restless, out of place. My professors praised my essays, and my peers respected my opinions, but I started to feel like I was reciting someone else's script. It was during a seminar on environmental law that I first felt the stirrings of something different. The professor, Dr. Linda Barrett, spoke passionately about the future of renewable energy and the role lawyers could play in shaping environmental policy. Her words lingered with me long after class, but not for the reasons my father would have hoped. I found myself more drawn to the idea of building solutions rather than debating them in a courtroom. I started reading about solar technology, wind turbines, and sustainable design in my spare time. The more I learned, the more I realized how deeply I wanted to do something tangible, something that could directly change lives rather than just argue over the rules. Bringing this up at home was never easy. My father, for all his intelligence, had a certain rigidity when it came to tradition. At Sunday dinners, when I cautiously mentioned the need for innovation in sustainable energy, he would wave his hand and remind me that real power lay in the courtroom. The world changes in courtrooms and boardrooms, Caroline, not in garages or laboratories, he said once, not unkindly, but with a finality that left no room for argument. My mother, for her part, just pursed her lips and changed the subject, asking if I'd decided which law journal to join. I quickly learned to keep my dreams to myself. Despite my family's certainty, my restlessness only grew. I found myself sneaking away from campus events to attend talks on technology and entrepreneurship. I'd sit in the back of crowded lecture halls, listening to speakers who had risked everything to build something new. I started taking notes, scribbling ideas in the margins of my casebooks, wondering what it would feel like to leap instead of following the script. My closest friend, Julia, who was finishing her engineering degree at MIT, became my confidant. We'd meet at a cramped coffee shop in Cambridge, where she'd show me prototypes she was working on, and I'd share my fears of letting everyone down. Looking back, I think I always knew I would have to choose between the life my parents wanted for me and the life I wanted for myself. The breaking point came one cold January morning. Snow had been falling all night, and the world outside was buried in white, silent and still. I sat in my bedroom, staring at the acceptance letter for a summer internship at my father's firm, and I felt a heaviness settle in my chest. I thought about the cases I'd be assigned, the partners I'd have to impress, the endless parade of cocktail parties and boardroom meetings. I thought about the years ahead, each one mapped out before me, each one a little less my own. Then I thought about the villages I'd read about, communities in America and Europe still struggling with unreliable power grids, kids doing homework by candlelight, and clinics unable to run basic equipment. I thought about the potential of solar power, the idea that I could help bring light, real, tangible light, into people's lives. It was a small dream, but it was mine. That morning, I made a decision. I would leave law school. I would walk away from the future my parents had so carefully constructed, and I would try, even if I failed, to build something new. I didn't tell my parents. I knew what the reaction would be. My father would call it a phase, my mother would be too hurt to speak, and both would remind me of everything I owed the Evans name. Instead, I called Julia. She didn't hesitate for a second. "Caroline, you only get one life," she said. "You might as well make it yours." I packed my things quietly, putting away textbooks I'd barely opened and folding suits I knew I'd never wear again. I left a short note for my roommate, letting her know I'd be gone for a few days, but I didn't mention my real plans. Julia picked me up in her old, dented Subaru, and we drove through the snowy streets of Cambridge, talking about everything and nothing. The world felt wide open, terrifying and exhilarating all at once. As we crossed the Charles River, the city stretched out before me, all glittering lights and endless possibilities. For the first time in my life, I felt the weight of expectation begin to lift. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew that whatever it was, it would be mine and mine alone. That was the day I quietly, irrevocably, began to rewrite my story. After closing the door on my family's expectations and the world of law, I stepped into a life that felt as small and uncertain as my new apartment in Somerville. My studio was hardly more than a glorified shoebox above a noisy pizzeria, with creaky floors, a window that overlooked the alley, and a radiator that made unsettling noises late at night. I had a mattress on the floor, a rickety desk from a thrift shop, and a tiny kitchenette that barely fit my battered coffee maker. Everything about my life now was temporary, fragile, and entirely my own. I remember standing in that space, my boxes stacked like barricades, wondering if I'd made a mistake I couldn't take back. The first few weeks passed in a blur of anxiety and coffee. My savings were laughably slim, just under $2,000 in my checking account, and every dollar seemed to vanish as soon as I spent it. I stretched my budget by living on instant ramen, black coffee, and the occasional slice of free pizza from the shop downstairs. Instead of networking events and lecture halls, I spent my nights huddled over my laptop, scrolling through forums on solar tech, scribbling half-baked ideas in my notebook, and emailing anyone who might give me advice. I felt free, but I was also terrified. During the day, I worked at a local tech startup on the edge of Kendall Square. The job was supposed to be temporary, just a way to pay my rent, but I soon found myself learning skills I'd never picked up at Harvard: troubleshooting code, pitching products, and convincing skeptical engineers that my ideas weren't entirely crazy. My boss, a wiry woman named Sophie with wild hair and relentless energy, seemed to exist on caffeine and stubbornness alone. I never told her my real ambitions, but something about her made me believe that building something new, against all odds, was possible. At night, the real work began. I named my company Sunbridge Solutions, a name that sounded grander than the reality of me working alone in my pajamas, surrounded by stacks of empty coffee cups. My vision was simple: to bring affordable solar infrastructure to the forgotten corners of America and Europe, places where power outages were a fact of life and renewable energy seemed like a distant dream. I didn't have the money, the experience, or even the connections, but I had an idea that I couldn't let go. It didn't take long to realize I needed help. That's when David came into the picture. He was my neighbor, a mechanical engineer with a mop of curly hair and a love for all things DIY. I first met him in the laundry room, where he was fixing the ancient dryer with parts scavenged from a broken toaster. We got to talking, and before I knew it, we were sketching solar panel layouts on the back of napkins and arguing about battery storage over cheap Chinese takeout. David became my co-conspirator, a partner who believed in the mission even when it was just the two of us against the world. Through David, I met Lisa, a marketing graduate from London who had landed in Boston for a year-long fellowship and decided never to leave. Lisa was the polar opposite of me: outgoing, quick with a joke, and fearless when it came to cold calling investors or charming journalists. I was always the quiet planner, but Lisa had a way of making me believe in the project when my doubts threatened to swallow me whole. Together, the three of us worked out of my apartment, our conference table, just a folding card table between the mattress and the radiator. We split our days between our real jobs and endless nights of brainstorming, grant writing, and prototype testing. Money was always tight. Every dollar we made from part-time gigs went back into Sunbridge Solutions. I learned to stretch every cent, shopping for parts at hardware store sales, scouring Craigslist for used equipment, and borrowing tools from neighbors. Our prototype panels were built from scratch in David's uncle's garage. I knew we couldn't survive on hope alone, so I started entering local pitch competitions, practicing my story until I could recite it in my sleep. The day I won our first $5,000 at a Cambridge entrepreneurship event, I almost fainted with relief. It was just enough to cover parts, a website, and a handful of marketing flyers. Despite the progress, I kept my double life a secret from my family. I lied on the phone, telling my mother about fictional law school exams and made-up study groups, all the while listening to my father's lectures about firm politics and family pride. I missed birthdays, Thanksgiving, and Christmas, claiming I was buried in work. Each excuse felt like another stone in the wall between us. Sometimes I wondered if they could hear the guilt in my voice. I tried to convince myself it was temporary, just until the company got off the ground, but the ache of their absence followed me everywhere. There were moments when I nearly gave up. Sometimes, after a long day at the startup and a longer night with Sunbridge Solutions, I would stare at our numbers and wonder if we were chasing an impossible dream. We hit setback after setback: broken panels, failed grant applications, meetings that went nowhere. But every time I thought about quitting, I remembered why I started. I remembered the articles I'd read about communities in Maine or small towns in Vermont where families couldn't depend on the grid, where one storm could plunge everyone into darkness. I remembered the feeling of powerlessness I'd felt back in Boston, trying to live someone else's life. If nothing else, I told myself, I wanted to give others a shot at something better. Our breakthrough came sooner than any of us expected. David found an article about a fishing village on the coast of Maine that had lost power after a nor'easter. The local schoolhouse had become a shelter, but they were running on diesel generators and running out of fuel. We pooled every dollar we had left, loaded up David's beat-up Honda, and drove north in the middle of a snowstorm. When we arrived, the town was dark except for a handful of flickering candles in windows. The principal, a woman named Ellen, listened to our pitch with skepticism but agreed to let us try. We spent the next 3 days sleeping on classroom floors, wiring panels, and hoping nothing would catch fire. When the lights finally flickered on in that old schoolhouse, I stood in the hallway and cried. I watched children run through the halls, their faces glowing in the new electric light. Parents hugged each other in relief, and for the first time, I felt the weight of my choices lift, replaced by a pride that was entirely my own. Word spread quickly. The local paper ran a story about Sunbridge Solutions, calling us the team of young dreamers who brought light to the coast. Within a week, my inbox was flooded with messages from other towns in Maine, and even a mayor from Vermont. I got a call from a small community in rural France, and Lisa's connections brought interest from a group in Scotland. We were suddenly in demand, scrambling to keep up with requests we'd once only dreamed of receiving, yet, even as the company started to grow, my personal life felt more complicated than ever. At home, my father talked endlessly about courtroom victories and the future of Evans and Associates, never once asking what I was up to. My mother's calls grew shorter and less frequent, her voice strained and distant. I sensed their disappointment, even though they didn't know the full truth. I wanted to tell them about the schoolhouse in Maine, the families in Vermont, the growing list of projects in Europe. I wanted them to see the person I was becoming. But every time I tried, the words caught in my throat, and I resorted to safe topics: the weather, my classes, their social plans. The loneliness of living in the shadows weighed on me. I watched friends from law school post photos of graduations, clerkships, and celebrations I would never attend. I wondered what it would feel like to be welcomed home as a hero, instead of hiding my victories in a studio apartment above a pizza shop. But when I won a $1 million grant from a major tech foundation in New York, an email that made my hands shake so badly I almost dropped my phone, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time, I let myself dream about a future where I could be honest, where my parents could see not just the daughter they wanted, but the woman I was becoming. Still, I kept my secret. I wasn't ready for the confrontation, or for the possibility that they would never understand. So I celebrated with David and Lisa, the three of us toasting with cheap wine as the city lights shimmered outside my window. In that moment, I knew we were building something real. Something worth every sacrifice, every sleepless night, and every shadow I still had to walk through. Christmas in the Evans household had always been a display of tradition and status, but that particular year, the festivities felt especially suffocating. My parents' house on Beacon Hill gleamed with holiday lights wound tightly around the wrought iron banisters and candles flickering in the tall windows. The grand foyer smelled of pine needles and cinnamon, and a live pianist played carols softly in the corner, setting a tone that was equal parts festive and formal. Each year, my mother outdid herself: polished silver, heirloom china, bouquets of winter roses, because Christmas Eve wasn't just a family gathering, but the social event of the season for Boston's legal elite. I arrived carrying a weight heavier than any gift. The ride over from Somerville was tense, the city streets glistening with slush and reflecting the red and green glow of traffic lights. I wore a simple navy dress and an old wool coat, hoping I looked presentable enough, but feeling every bit the outsider. I tried to steady my nerves, clutching the bottle of wine I'd brought as a peace offering, all the while rehearsing excuses in my head for another year of secrets. The house was already buzzing with laughter and the clinking of glasses. Old family friends mingled in the parlor, partners from Evans and Associates lingered by the fireplace, and my younger brother, Henry, home from his first semester at Yale, was in the kitchen raiding the cheese platter. As I stepped through the door, my mother swept toward me in a sea of emerald velvet and pearls, her arms outstretched and her smile fixed in place. She greeted me with a kiss on the cheek, already fussing over my coat and hair, and then ushered me into the crowd, making polite introductions to people whose faces I'd seen at every holiday for as long as I could remember. My father stood near the bay window, holding court with a circle of his colleagues, his laugh booming over the music. His presence, as always, commanded the room. He looked up as I approached, his expression a mixture of pride and scrutiny. I braced myself, waiting for his inevitable questions about law school and career plans. Instead, he hugged me, a gesture more formal than affectionate, and introduced me to Judge Hastings, an old friend of the family who'd presided over several high-profile cases with my father. I answered questions on autopilot, careful to keep my stories straight, telling half-truths about law school papers and the internship that didn't exist. I could feel the strain behind my words, the persistent knot in my stomach tightening with every conversation. All around me, the talk was of court victories, campaign fundraisers, and new appointments to state boards. No one asked about solar panels or rural schools, and the only mention of renewable energy was as a punchline to a joke about hippie startups in California. Dinner was served in the formal dining room, the table set with the good silver and tall crystal glasses. I found myself seated between my father and Henry, with my mother directly across from me. Conversation ebbed and flowed. Henry told stories about Yale, my father recounted the firm's recent successes, and my mother passed dishes with practiced grace. I smiled and nodded, trying to eat, my appetite buried beneath the dread that something, anything, could give me away. It was after the second course, as the plates were being cleared and the candles flickered low, that the conversation circled back to me. My father turned to me, his voice carrying easily down the table. "So, Caroline," he said, smiling, "how are classes? Which firm are you planning to clerk with this summer? I heard from your old professor last week, he had only the highest praise." I froze. For a split second, I considered lying, playing along for another year. But the strain of double lives, the loneliness of hiding my work, and the hollow pride I saw in my father's eyes, all of it crashed down at once. I looked at the faces around me, my brother, full of hope and curiosity, my mother, waiting for the right answer, and my father, expecting only affirmation of the family's legacy. Something inside me snapped, not out of anger, but out of exhaustion. I was tired of pretending, tired of carrying the weight alone. I set down my fork and cleared my throat. The table quieted, forks poised in midair. I tried to steady my voice, which trembled despite my best efforts. "Dad, I'm not going back to law school," I began. "I left last year." For a moment, no one seemed to understand. My mother's eyes widened, Henry's fork clattered onto his plate, and my father's face turned slowly from confusion to disbelief. Before he could interrupt, I pressed on, the words tumbling out faster now. "I started my own company. It's called Sunbridge Solutions. We build solar infrastructure for towns and communities that don't have reliable electricity. We started small, just me and a couple of friends, but now we're providing power to families in Maine, Vermont, even parts of rural France and Scotland. We've won grants, partnered with schools, and changed lives." My voice caught, emotion tightening my throat. I did all of this because it mattered to me, because I wanted to make a difference, not just in a courtroom, but in the real world. The silence was complete. Even the pianist seemed to sense the shift and slowed to a halt. For a moment, all I heard was the clink of glass and the faint sound of snow tapping against the windows. Then my mother's face crumpled. She pressed her napkin to her mouth, eyes brimming with tears. My father's face reddened, jaw set in a way I'd only seen during his most difficult trials. "How could you?" His voice was low but carried an edge sharper than any I'd heard before. "You threw away everything we built for you. Your name, your education, the future we gave you." He looked at me as if I were a stranger. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The Evans family is built on reputation, on tradition. You risked it all for," he waved his hand dismissively. "Solar panels? Charity work? You could have been anything." I tried to hold his gaze, but my resolve wavered. "Dad, it isn't just charity. It's a business, a successful one. We've helped hundreds of families. I've built something real." He cut me off, voice rising. "What about our name? Our legacy? You think your little project can compare to that? You embarrassed us, lied to us, and for what? Some fleeting dream?" He looked away, as if the sight of me was too much to bear. "If you can't respect what this family stands for, then maybe you don't belong in this house." I looked to my mother, hoping for a sign of understanding, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs, hands trembling in her lap. Henry reached out, wanting to comfort me, but my father's glare stopped him cold. I knew then that there was nothing left to say. I stood, my chair scraping loudly against the hardwood, and tried not to cry. I walked out of the dining room, past the portraits of ancestors who'd never know my name, and up to my old bedroom. I packed a small bag, hands shaking as I stuffed a few clothes and my laptop inside. I left the bottle of wine unopened on my desk. A silent farewell to Julia, ever my lifeline, was waiting outside in her battered old Volkswagen. The snow was falling, thick and fast, and the city looked softer under its quiet blanket. I slid into the passenger seat, letting the tears fall freely now, and Julia squeezed my hand without saying a word. As she drove me away from Beacon Hill, the lights of my childhood home faded behind us, and for the first time, I felt both loss and relief. That night, as we crossed the Charles River, I realized I had finally told my truth. I had risked everything for the life I wanted, not the one my family demanded. The pain of rejection burned, but underneath it, a flicker of freedom began to grow. My secret was out. The path forward was uncertain, but at least now it belonged to me. Moving to Newport, Rhode Island, was more than a change of address, it was the first act of true independence I had ever taken. My grant money had arrived in a single wire transfer, an almost surreal sum that finally gave me the freedom to leave behind the shadows of Boston and the small apartment in Somerville. I toured a handful of places on the windswept coast, but the house I chose was nothing like my family's grand, tradition-steeped mansion on Beacon Hill. This home was small, a two-story shingled cottage with salt on its windows and a porch that seemed to reach out over the Atlantic itself. I fell in love with its simplicity, faded hardwood floors, sun-bleached walls, and a view of the water that made every sunrise feel like a promise kept. Each morning, I woke before dawn, padded barefoot into the kitchen, and brewed a pot of strong coffee. I would step outside onto the porch, mug in hand, and watch the pale golden pink streaks stretch across the sky. The waves crashed against the rocks in a constant, soothing rhythm, and I felt, perhaps for the first time, what it meant to be at peace with my choices. Newport itself was a quieter place than Boston, but the community was lively, full of artists, fishermen, and people who understood what it meant to start again. I fit right in, not because of my last name, but because of the work I did and the hope I carried. With a real office set up in my sunlit living room, Sunbridge Solutions entered a new era. Gone were the days of huddling around a card table in Somerville, holding our breath with every grant application and prototype. Now, our work felt bigger, urgent and real. We built partnerships with town managers across the Midwest, bringing solar microgrids to farming communities in Iowa and Nebraska. I hired a small team of engineers and outreach coordinators, each one hungry to make a difference, many of them young women who reminded me of myself just a few years earlier. Lisa took charge of our European expansion, splitting her time between London and the French countryside. She sent postcards and emails, full of stories about the people we were helping, a bakery in Normandy that no longer lost power during storms, a rural school in Scotland with heat and light all winter long. David, ever the inventor, spent weeks at a time on the road, tinkering with new battery systems in barns, school basements, and the garages of clients who soon became friends. I sometimes marveled at how far we had come, how the kernel of an idea had grown into a company serving hundreds of communities on both sides of the Atlantic. By the time our third year rolled around, Sunbridge Solutions had become more than a startup. It was a name people in the world of renewable energy started to recognize. We won a contract to retrofit solar panels in a network of hospitals in rural Vermont and received a profile in a national business magazine, featuring a photograph of me standing on the porch of my Newport home, the ocean stretching endlessly behind me. I read the article twice, hardly able to believe it was my story. My phone rang nonstop for days, as other companies, potential investors, and even university professors reached out, eager to collaborate or learn from our experience. Then came the letter from Washington, D.C., an invitation to serve as an advisor to the United States Department of Energy's Sustainability Council. At first, I thought it was a mistake or some kind of joke. I read the message 3 times before it sank in. They wanted my perspective, my input on the national stage. It was a seat at the table I never thought I'd be invited to, and for a moment, I was overcome with gratitude for every risk I had taken, every lonely night spent believing in a future that no one else could see. My work on the council was both exhilarating and humbling. I commuted to Washington every month, joining meetings filled with experts and policymakers, and learned how to argue for real change among people who could make it happen. Sometimes, I would look around the table and remember those dinners back on Beacon Hill, my father lecturing on legal precedent while I stayed quiet. Now, my voice carried weight. I wasn't just seen, I was heard, respected, and valued for exactly who I was. There was an irony to my new life that I couldn't ignore. Not long after joining the council, I learned that the Evans family law firm, Evans & Associates, was facing a major environmental compliance case. They had taken on a corporate client in trouble over outdated power systems and pollution violations. The client, to turn things around, applied for federal sustainability grants and regulatory leniency, exactly the kind of issues our council was created to oversee. It took only a moment of reading through the proposals to see the familiar letterhead and my father's signature beneath a long legal argument. No one at the law firm knew I was there. The proposal was reviewed like any other, judged on its merits and its potential to do good. I felt a pang of complicated sadness reading my family's words, realizing that even as they had rejected my path, their work now relied on the very world I had helped shape. I did not let the knowledge change my judgment. If anything, I was more rigorous, determined that my integrity would be above reproach. Even when my family's name appeared before me, that moment crystallized the strange, beautiful reality of my journey. While my parents had turned their backs on me, the world had turned toward me, ready to listen and learn. The legacy I had feared losing was not the one they tried to hand me, but the one I had painstakingly built with every late night, every dollar raised, and every community powered up. There were days, especially in winter, when the wind off the Atlantic cut straight through my jacket and the house creaked in protest, that I found myself looking back. Sometimes I would remember the Evans house in Boston, the feel of the heavy front door, the sound of my father's laughter echoing down the marble hall, my mother's soft voice calling me in for supper. I wondered, in those moments, if they ever read about Sunbridge Solutions in the news, if they ever saw my name on a panel or watched one of my interviews. I wondered if they missed me, or if they still believed that I had betrayed their trust, traded legacy for a whim. But more often, I thought of the children in Maine who could finish their homework after sunset, the bakery in Normandy that opened its doors to the whole village after a storm, the elderly couple in Nebraska who no longer worried about the cost of heat in the winter. Their letters and emails filled me with purpose. I kept a box of thank you notes on my kitchen table, rereading them when doubts crept in. My work was not about proving anything to my family. It was about the people who depended on us, who trusted us, who were finally seen. Lisa visited often, sometimes staying for weeks. We'd walk along the rocky shoreline, swapping stories and plotting new expansion plans. David would call from some rural town, excited about a new technical breakthrough, his laughter as bright as the morning sun. Our team grew, not just in numbers, but in spirit, every person drawn to the same sense of mission and possibility that had first set me on this path. When I received an invitation to speak at a global conference in London, I nearly said no. Public speaking had always terrified me, but Lisa insisted it was time to own the story, my story. I stood on stage before hundreds of strangers, looking out at the faces of engineers, scientists, and dreamers from around the world. I spoke about risk, about starting over, about the quiet courage it takes to defy expectations and listen to your voice. When I finished, the applause was thunderous, but what mattered most was the small line of young women who waited afterward to tell me that my journey had helped them see a future for themselves. Too, standing by the ocean at the end of each day, I watched the horizon stretch toward Europe, and I understood something I never had in Boston. My story was not one of rebellion, but of creation. I had not abandoned a legacy, I had built my own, light by light, community by community, dollar by hard-earned dollar. My family's silence was still a wound, but it no longer defined me. The world was wide, the possibilities endless, and for the first time, I belonged completely to myself.